Hi, I'm Marina from frocksandfrolics.com and we're working with the Ottobre magazine again. We're making this fantastic little coat, and this time I'm going to show you how to work the collar. The first thing we're going to do is to put the under collar on top of the upper collar with the right sides facing each other, and the under collar is a little bit smaller than the upper collar, and that is brilliant because it helps the collar roll under and you don't get those edges that peep up, which you often see with home sewn stuff. This is going to sit absolutely brilliantly. If you want to find out more about this whole project, you can go in the description of this video, click on the link, and you'll find the playlist where we're cutting everything out, going through the pattern, showing you how to trace the pattern out, all of that. So then you're prepared for this step. So here we're pinning it together, and you can see now how it rolls up around the edge. So that will give you a beautiful collar. First step is to sew this together. We're leaving the lower edge open. And you need to make sure as you pull the pins out that this does not move. And there we go, around the curve slowly. And I'm using a 1 centimeter seam allowance because that's what I put on there. And you don't want the fabric to push at all. That's really important as well, because if it pushes over the edge, then it will not quite fit. So edge to edge all the way around. And now we're cutting back the seam allowance. We're cutting it back pretty sharpish from the side which does not have the violin on it. And then the other side will be the slightly longer layer. And it's really important to cut your collar in such a way that you have layers, otherwise it will be really thick and top stitching will be hard and your machine foot won't sit on it very well. This is quite important for all your sewing. So if you're just learning all this stuff, cutting your seam allowances back in layers in collars is what you need to do. And the thicker the fabric, the more important this becomes. Now, as the next thing, I'm going to cut back the upper collar as well, just where we have the curve. The rest I leave standing. And then I went back in a little bit here, and I've cut it back even more in the curve. There we go, a really short layer. To make your life easier, what you want to do is iron that seam apart first, and then we can iron the whole collar, and then we can top stitch it. And when that's done, we're going to iron from the side which doesn't have the interfacing on, that's the under collar, to get a really nice result. So flip it over, roll out the edges really well so that the seam sits right in the center of it. If anything, you want to see the upper collar slightly showing for this step. It makes it easier. But generally speaking, it needs to be exactly in the middle, right? So very straight. And then I take my cloth again, and I'm going to put that on, and with the dampness of the cloth and the pressure and the heat of the iron, it will bring all the fibers of your material together and create a really flat looking collar. And that's so important. I would really recommend that you do not become one of those seamstresses or seamstressers that irons at the end, because it's not going to look good. You can never get the results if you don't iron all the way through. In fact, when you hang this up and you're finished, it won't need a final iron. It'll be done. Now, I'm going to iron this again. Don't burn your fingers now. Wait until your damp cloth or wet cloth, I wrung it out. It's not dripping wet, but it's wet. And then you put your weight on and you get a beautiful result. And you do that for the entire collar all the way to the end. And then it's ready to go on the sewing machine. And it also makes it easier on the sewing machine, of course, because it's flat. It's just going to transport it better, trust me. So don't skip the ironing. Look at that. It already looks really flat, and you could do without top stitching if you were making a collar for a different type of coat, right? I love top stitching now. Now we're going to do that. Put your tension up to 7 or 8. Hold the threads here, and you can see the bobbin thread and the top thread both are in the top stitching thread, right? So it will not want to work so well. It may even leave out a stitch, but if it does, you can just fiddle that, and you can pull the stitch down with the thread that you normally use, which is the blue thread, if you like, and nobody will know any better. I was very lucky here. It didn't leave out stitches, but generally speaking, if you have a sewing machine that's not quite as good, it will do. And on some of the parts which you see in some of these video tutorials that I do, I did leave out stitches, and I just pulled them in, and nobody's any the wiser. Make sure now that none of it has shifted, so I hold it with my right hand, making sure that everything is nice and neat and flat on top of each other, and move slowly around the curve, stitch by stitch. Stitch length again 3.5 or even 4. It depends on your sewing machine. My stitch is almost too small, but I think it looked fine when I was done. Would I do it again? Probably would use stitch length 4, but I think it's absolutely fine. And Magdalena, my little model who's wearing this now, she's worn it to school. I keep saying these things, but it's so great when a kiddo actually wants to wear what you sew for them, because that doesn't happen all the time, does it? You spend all this time and it's in the corner, they don't want to wear it, and you go, oh, no, all that fabric, all that work. And this coat is a complete success. Now, we don't lock in our stitches for this. What you want to do is pull them away, and that's because if you tried to go backwards and forwards and lock in your stitches at beginning and the end, you'll find you get a knot, it won't transport, it'll get stuck. It's just not what you want to do. So I pull them away, cut them off. And because we're going to put the collar stand on now, you don't need to worry that for some reason it might come apart. It won't. I'll do the same for all the other threads until they're all pulled away. And then guess what? Let's go get that damn cloth, and I'll give it another press. Now this might be a little bit overkill, but I like everything to be flat, including my stitching, and the stitching will still have some sort of structure where it stands up a little bit more. If you like that, you can leave it. You don't need to do this step necessarily. I think it can't hurt. So I'm going over again, and I'm doing this with the wet cloth or the damp cloth. I bring it out, of course. And, you know, once I'm done with this, it'll be just a perfect edge. And then in your sewing instructions, it then says that you need to baste the rough edges together. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to baste the rough edges together, and don't forget that one of the pieces is shorter than the other, and so we're going to lift that on top, and I put a pin here in the center first, and then I go to one side or go to the other side, and that will also guarantee that rolling. We've got that already on the edges of the collar, and now we'll also have it here in the main piece, and you can see how beautiful that rolls. And look at my top stitching as well. It's fab. I really love this coat. I wasn't sure while I was making it, as you are never are, until you put it on. I put it on myself and I thought, man, this is so nice. I want this coat, and I'm telling you, I'm going to make that in a bigger size for myself. It's so beautiful, and the fit's great as well. So now I'm putting this together with stitch length 4, and make sure that your fabric doesn't push. You can hold it with a pin with your right hand as you're sewing. Maybe sew it from the other side, actually pin it from where you have the interfacing. That makes it a little bit easier. Then it's time for a little bit of tea. I've got a Jubilee cup from the Queen. It's really old, that cup. And yeah, now on we go. We're going to put the collar stand on. So first of all, we're going to put the one that has the interfacing on, and we're going to put that on with the right sides facing, of course. So I'm just going to pop that up here so it's very visual and you can see it. And that will now sit on there. So you have interfacing on interfacing. Put a pin in the center to hold the pieces together. And then we're going to do the same here on the edges. And don't forget, we have a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. And that centimeter doesn't need to be at the top where you have the rough edge, but you want it where the seam's going to sit, right? So there we go. That's where it's got to be. And I'm going to pin it in right there. You don't want it at the top. You want it exactly where you're going to be sewing. So I'm going to put a pin in here. And then I'm going to do the same all the way along, and of course on the other side as well. Now I'm going to baste this in, making sure I start exactly where my collar starts. This is really important. And it's also a 1 centimeter seam allowance exactly. So move the needle down with your presser foot up, exactly where your collar starts. Go a few stitches forward, same amount of stitches back, so you hit that point again. And then just with the right seam allowance, which is 1 centimeter in my case, you go right to the other side. And then we're going to do the same again. We're going to stop exactly where the collar ends. So don't overshoot, because that stitching line we're going to use when we put the other part of the collar on. All the way across. Excellent. And don't let the fabric push. It wants to push here. Look, I'm lifting my presser foot and I'm moving it under again, and then I go to the end. And I stop exactly where it ends, right in that point. A few stitches backwards, and I've caught that point exactly. Now we're going to put the other part of the collar stand on, which does not have the interfacing, so make sure the right side is facing your collar. And we can put that underneath it and pin it on. Now the collar will be slightly in the way. You need to move that out of the way and then just fold it under a bit. There we go. And move it over, and we're going to close that from the rough edge to that point where we've already got the stitching line. Then turn the machine and sew it together, and that way you get a really nice collar stand perfectly attached to where it needs to go. Do the same on the other side. Move away the collar, pin it, and again we put a pin in here at the top. Just make sure that the collar stand is edge to edge. That's all you need to watch out for. You don't need to overpin the rest of it. I'm just putting one pin in here for the center back of my collar. Over to the sewing machine. Let's sew this bad boy together. So first lock in your stitches, then move your pin out, and then having very good control of your fabric, sew to the point where you can see the stitching line. Okay, you can see it there, so it's fairly easy to do unless you've overshot, and then it's not going to be perfect. But if you started where the collar started, that line is just going to tell you exactly where you need to hit that point. And then we turn and we follow the stitching line we've already got. We are exactly on it. And if you find you can't get right, use a zipper foot and put the needle all the way over to the left to get round. Now my machine did it quite nicely, but if it had struggled, I would have done that. So now we're moving all the way to the other side, exactly on that stitching line. So much easier when you're sewing from the side that has the interfacing on. I don't know why I didn't do it on some of the other parts. So if you can, always stitch from the side that has the interfacing on. Go to the point, then move the collar out of the way. Right, hitting that point, lift the presser foot, turn, move the collar out of the way, and sew to the end. And the worst is over. Well, you've done it. Now we're going to check that we have hit that point exactly and that it doesn't stand over. This is not a shirt. It needs to be exactly one line. And if it does that, you go, yeah, that's great. I can start cutting it back. Check the other side as well. And if that hadn't been right, I would have just tried to get a little bit closer there. It's really important that that all sits perfectly. And in your instructions, it says trim seam allowances across corners, turn collar stand right side out, top stitch the front edges and join seam on collar stand and machine baste its open edges together. Now that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? So I'm going to cut back my seam allowances here a little bit. There we go. And now I'm also going to cut back just at the top my collar stand, which doesn't have the interfacing on, and I'm doing that really close to the seam almost, you know, because it gets ever so thick. You've got all these layers in there and you want to make sure that it's nice and flat. But trust me, once we've ironed this, they go, oh no, here she goes with the ironing again. I'm even using a wet cloth for this because it's so thick. And I'm ironing apart the collar stand, which has the interfacing on, so that it's easier in a minute to iron the whole thing. But like I said, you never have to iron this again. This will just sit beautifully. So give it a good press. No need to put the weight on there. You just want this to you know, to sit nicely apart. And so you go as far as you can to the end, and then you put the rough edges on top of each other like that. Wet cloth again. This time we're going to use the weight as well. So move it off when it's dry, and then wait until the steam has evaporated and you can no longer see it escaping your fabric. Move it off and you get a beautiful finish. And of course we're going to do that all the way along like we always do. Pull it a little bit from the lower edge here and then really make sure that there isn't a pleat anywhere or a slight shift. It needs to be really tight. So you could also pull on the collar a bit just to make sure that it's out and that there isn't a little bit of collar sticking in too much, so you end up with a little fold where the collar stand and the collar meet. Really force this down. This takes pressure, okay, so like really do it. Then move it off as it dries, put the weight back on and really press that down as well, and you have a result like somebody would do with a professional press. But then you couldn't use a professional press on this, could you? Because you don't want your collar to be crumpled. So I'm afraid this is how it goes. So just do the other end real quick and then we're done. And look how beautiful that sits already. Check your work all the time. Carry on to the next step. Baste those edges together. You could do that by hand. You can do it by sewing machine, but you will need a long stitch to do it. Sew this down. And then we're going to top stitch immediately around it. And I'm stitching close to the edge, and stitch length is 4. All the way across, make sure that nothing shifts. Beautiful. I love this coat. Have I said this before? And Magdalena here is actually wearing it to school. So for success, she loves the coat, and I'm glad that she does, because I spent so much time making it, and that's no fun when you make it and the kiddo that you make it for don't like it. So bring up the thread, thread up your machine, and then you stitch all the way around. Make sure that you always have the same distance to the edge as you had with all your other top stitching. Now I've got a double line of thread on the collar, and I am not doing that on the collar stand, because if I did, I also would have to top stitch the edge of the front of my coat double, and I don't want to do that. Come round very slowly. Don't go too fast, because this top stitching thread does like to loop underneath it, and so take your time doing it. And that's it. If you wanted to, you could press it again, but it's not necessary. This is absolutely fabulous. It lies really nice and round. And let's have a little sneak peek here at the finished coat. Isn't that fantastic? Great. I hope to see you next time when we're going to put the actual shell of our coat together. See you there. Bye for now.